Dusk settled over the meadow, and the light thinned to a pale wash across the hedgerows. Near the roots of one tangled thicket, a fox cub lay still. Its small body was pressed close to the soil, its fur matted with damp, its chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. There was no movement around it, no playful rustle of siblings nearby, and no soft calls from a mother vixen. Only the faint sound of grass brushing in the breeze and the weak tremor of life that seemed ready to fade. A villager walking the edge of the field slowed when he noticed it. He had not been searching for wildlife, only making his way home, but the shape caught his eye, a small russet patch that did not sway like grass. He paused and bent down, careful not to startle. The cub did not flinch. Its head rested sideways, its eyes half closed, its ears limp against its head. The man could see the fragile breath lifting its ribs, a sign of life so faint it almost looked like stillness. Around the hedgerow there were no other foxes. The soil was cool, as though nobody had warmed the den in hours. It was too late in the evening for a mother to be absent this long. The cub had been left, whether by chance, separation, or loss. Alone, it could not keep its warmth through the night. If nothing changed, it would not see the next dawn. The villager crouched lower, resting his hand against the earth to steady himself. He stayed like that for some time, watching quietly. The cub's paws twitched as though stirred by a fading instinct to crawl, but no strength followed. The man spoke only once, barely above a whisper, "Easy, little one." His words made no difference to the cub, but his voice carried the gentleness of recognition, that this was a living creature on the edge of survival. The risks were plain. If he left, the cub would almost certainly die. If he touched it, the scent of human hands might complicate any chance of reunion. Yet to walk away meant surrendering it to cold ground and predators that moved silently through the night fields. He waited for any sign, a distant bark, a rustle that might belong to a searching vixen. None came. The sky grew dimmer, and the shadows lengthened across the grass. The cub gave a soft, thin cry, barely a sound at all. Its muzzle opened and closed again, weak and uncertain. The villager shifted closer, lowering his hand into the grass. The cub stirred faintly at the change of air, but it did not rise. Its strength was already too far gone. He studied its body carefully. The fur was rough at the edges, its belly a little sunken, its legs thin and stiff with fatigue. Every detail made the stakes sharper. If nothing changed, if no warmth or milk reached this body soon, the tiny breath he saw now would be the last. He looked once more toward the field. There was only the steady drone of insects, the low hum of evening settling. The cub whimpered again, softer still, and its head tilted as though trying to lift but failing. That was enough. The man moved his scarf from his neck, spread it in the grass, and with slow, respectful hands slid the cloth beneath the cub. The body was light, shockingly so, and it sagged into the folds without resistance. He wrapped the corners close, creating a small pocket of warmth. The cub shivered, then stilled. It did not fight, it only breathed, faint and slow, held now against the rhythm of his steady hands. The villager rose, the scarf bundled carefully, his eyes scanning the hedgerow one last time. If the mother returned in the next moment, he would step back. But the silence stretched on, heavy and unbroken. As he turned toward the path, he understood the weight he carried was more than the cub itself. It was the narrow line between life and loss, measured in minutes, held within fragile lungs. The night air cooled around him, but within the scarf, a faint warmth persisted. That was the only sign that hope remained. The villager moved carefully along the line of hedgerow, the small weight in his scarf shifting faintly with each step. He knew foxes often returned to dens near the roots of old trees or along dry banks, and if this cub had a family, it would be close. The soil was soft beneath his boots, marked by scattered tunnels and worn trails. He crouched low, listening for any sharp cry or rustle, but the only sound was the muted whimper of the cub in his arms. At the base of a hollow oak, he found the den. The entrance was wide enough for a grown vixen, its edges smoothed by repeated use. He knelt, placing the cub gently to one side, and touched the earth just within the opening. The dirt was cold. No scent of fresh bedding rose, and no warmth of recent rest lingered. His hand moved deeper into the soil, but the chill held steady. It had not been occupied in hours, maybe longer. The hollow carried the silence of absence. He paused there, waiting, scanning the fields for movement. Foxes are cautious but attentive mothers. A call, a shift in the grass, or even a faint bark would have given him reason to hope. The dusk deepened, turning the air cooler, and no sign came. The cub stirred, letting out a thin, breathless squeak. The sound was soft, more air than voice, yet in the stillness it cut sharp. The villager leaned down and whispered, "Hold on, little one." His tone was not meant to comfort, only to steady his own hands. The cub's body trembled in the scarf. Its ribs pressed against the cloth with each shallow breath. He studied its form carefully, noting how the legs barely kicked when it cried and how the head dropped quickly with exhaustion. If this cub had siblings, they were no longer here. If it had a mother, she was not coming. Without warmth and milk, the night would be final. The stakes were simple and immediate. Stay here, and the cub would die. He searched the den once more, reaching further, his arm brushing against rough earth. His hand found no softness of fur, no living shape tucked deeper inside. Only emptiness. The silence of the hollow seemed to echo, carrying the truth outward into the fading light. The fox family was gone. This cub had been left behind. The man drew back slowly, his knees pressing into the grass. For a moment he sat still, listening again, but the field gave him nothing. The cub gave another small cry, weaker than before, and pressed its face into the folds of the scarf. It was searching for warmth where none existed, and the sound struck him with plain finality. If nothing changed, this body would not last an hour against the creeping cold. He pulled the scarf close again, lifting the cub against his chest. The fragile frame nestled deeper, and he felt the faintest flicker of heat against his shirt. The decision had already been made. No mother's call had come, no sibling appeared from the shadows, and the ground beneath the den told its own story of departure. If he walked away now, the cub would be left with nothing but soil and night. As he rose, he looked once more toward the hedge. A thin wind moved through the grass, carrying no sound but its own rustle. The den remained empty, its hollow mouth dark and still. The man adjusted the scarf, steadying the small weight against him. The cub's breaths came faint, yet they continued. That was all he had, and all that mattered. With slow, steady steps, he turned back toward the path. The choice was plain, the stakes unbending. If no one helped, the night would take it. And so he walked on, carrying the fragile life that now depended entirely on what he did next. The cub lay curled in the scarf, its body limp against the folds of fabric. The villager held it close, feeling how light it was, how little strength remained inside. For a moment he stood at the edge of the hedge, listening again for any distant call that might change the course of things. The field stayed silent, broken only by the faintest cry from the bundle in his arms. That sound fixed the choice in place. Leaving it meant certain death. Carrying it meant at least the chance of survival. He shifted the scarf carefully, drawing the cloth around the cub until only its muzzle showed. The animal trembled, tiny shudders rippling through its body. Its eyes fluttered half open, then shut again, as if each breath required all its strength. The man lowered his face slightly toward it and whispered, "Easy now." The cub made no response, but its chest moved in a weak rhythm, shallow but steady. The villager began walking. His steps were slow at first, steadying the small weight against him. The scarf warmed quickly with his body heat, wrapping the cub in a shelter it had lost when the den was abandoned. The evening air cooled around him, carrying the scent of damp earth and cut grass. Each step away from the hedge deepened the commitment he had made. The stakes were simple. In his hands the cub might live, but left behind it would not last an hour. The cub stirred faintly, shifting its head against the cloth. A thin sound escaped, soft and rasping, not quite a cry but a reminder of how fragile its voice had become. The man paused on the path, adjusting the folds so the cub's body was better supported. He could feel the bones beneath the fur, sharp against his palm, and he knew how close this life was to ending. That knowledge carried with it a kind of urgency, though his movements remained calm, measured, and respectful of the weakness he held. As the village lights began to flicker faintly in the distance, he thought only of the hours ahead. The cub needed warmth, and it needed milk. Without both, its body would collapse before morning. If he failed to act quickly, the effort of carrying it this far would mean nothing. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy, though the cub itself weighed almost nothing at all. The scarf shifted again, and he felt the cub's paw push faintly outward, a weak reflex. Its claws caught for a moment in the weave of the cloth, then relaxed. The movement was brief, but it was proof of life that went beyond shallow breaths. The man steadied the scarf and resumed his walk, his hands firm, his steps sure. Every few paces he tilted his head to check the rise and fall of the tiny chest. The breaths came unevenly, sometimes with a pause too long, but always returning. Each return was a small victory against the silence of the empty den he had left behind. The stakes had not changed. If warmth and food did not reach this cub soon, even these faint signs would fade. But carried close, wrapped tight against his chest, the animal had a chance. By the time he reached the first fence that marked the edge of the village, the cub was still. For a moment he feared the stillness was final, but then the scarf shifted with a fragile exhale. The man's hand closed more firmly over the bundle, drawing it nearer. His path was no longer uncertain. The decision had been made, and his role was clear. The cub's survival now rested entirely on what he did next. The night deepened, quiet around him, but within the scarf a small body remained alive. The tremble of breath against cloth was the only sound that mattered, the only measure that kept him walking forward. Inside the small cottage, the villager set the bundle down with care. The scarf unfolded to reveal the cub's body, limp and narrow, its fur still damp from the grass. The fire had been stoked earlier, and now its warmth spread low across the room. He placed the cub close enough to feel the heat, but not so near that it would overwhelm its fragile state. The animal stirred faintly, one paw shifting, then tucking back under its chest. Its breathing was shallow and irregular but still present. That was enough to begin. From a shelf he took a clay bowl and poured in a small measure of goat's milk. He knew it would not be the same as a mother's, yet it was all he had. With careful hands he diluted it slightly, warmed it to blood temperature, and set it on the floor near the cub. The liquid shimmered in the firelight, giving off a faint steam. He crouched low, his face close to the scarf. "Just a little," he whispered, his voice steady. The cub did not move toward the bowl. Its eyes opened briefly, cloudy and heavy, then closed again. Its head sagged into the folds, too weak to rise. The villager reached for a small wooden spoon, dipped it into the milk, and brought a drop to the edge of the cub's mouth. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the tiny tongue flicked, catching the liquid. The cub swallowed, a faint effort that barely lifted its throat. He tried again, drop by drop, waiting after each one. The tongue moved, unsteady but insistent enough to show a will to live. Minutes passed like this. The man crouched, patient, tilting the spoon, the cub responding with slight licks. After several tries, he shifted the bowl closer, guiding its muzzle gently. The cub's head rested against the rim, and with another faint push of its tongue, it began to drink directly, the milk rippling at each movement. Its breaths came faster now, shallow but determined, and its small jaw worked with quiet effort. The villager kept his hands steady on either side of the bowl. He did not move suddenly and did not urge the cub on. Each swallow mattered, and each pause carried risk. Too much, and its weak stomach might fail. Too little, and its strength would not return. The stakes were clear. If the cub could not take in enough nourishment tonight, it would not make it through the cold hours ahead. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. The cub's fur, drying in the warmth, lifted slightly at the tips. Its ears twitched now and then. Faint reflexes that showed life still flickered inside. The milk bowl lowered as the level dropped, small ripples fading with each sip. At last, when the cub stopped and lay still, its belly rounded only slightly, the villager drew the bowl back. The effort had ended in success, but survival remained fragile. He gathered the scarf again and wrapped the cub, placing it against a folded blanket by the fire. Its breaths, though still shallow, carried a steadier rhythm than before. Its body no longer shivered against the cold. The villager sat nearby, watching quietly, listening to the faint sound of air moving in and out of lungs that had almost failed. The cub gave a single weak cry, not in distress but as if acknowledging the warmth now surrounding it. Then it pressed its nose deeper into the cloth and lay still. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but for the first time since he had found it in the grass, the animal had taken food. And with that, the chance of life was no longer only hope, it was real. The fire burned low, its glow steady against the stone hearth. The villager sat near it, his body still, though his eyes remained fixed on the small bundle beside him. Wrapped in the scarf and pressed against folded cloth, the cub lay curled in on itself. Its sides moved unevenly, breath shallow but present. Now and again a thin whimper broke the silence, a sound so faint it might have been missed if not for the quiet of the room. Each cry reminded him that the fight was not yet over. Hours passed with little change. The cub stirred in brief spasms, legs twitching as if searching for a warmth that memory alone could summon. Its nose burrowed deeper into the scarf, pressing against the fabric where the scent of human hands lingered. The man reached out once, laying a steady palm close, not touching directly but close enough that his body's warmth reached the fragile shape. The cub gave a faint shiver and stilled again, breath ragged but steady. The risks remained constant. Its body was weak, its reserves nearly gone. Food had been taken, but too little to guarantee strength through the long night. If its breaths faltered, if its small body cooled despite the fire, the fight would end before dawn. The villager knew this and did not let his eyes close. He sat in silence, watching the rise and fall of the scarf with each shallow rhythm. The night deepened. Outside, wind shifted through the hedges, carrying faint sounds of owls across the field. Within the cottage there was only the fire and the soft, fractured whimpers of the cub. Each one pierced the stillness, each one a reminder that life remained, though fragile and uncertain. When the sound grew fainter, the villager leaned closer, lowering his face until he could hear the breath itself. He whispered only once. A single phrase meant more for the silence than the cub. "Not alone anymore." The words carried into the air and disappeared, but the cub stirred faintly at the sound, its paw shifting within the cloth. Through the long hours the villager stayed beside it, never moving far. He added wood to the fire in slow intervals, keeping the warmth constant. Each time he adjusted the blanket, the cub twitched, ears giving small, sharp flicks in instinct. Its body was too weak to cry out loudly, but its survival was marked in every whimper, every pause followed by the next breath. As the night wore on, the cub pressed closer into the folds of fabric, its nose nestled deep, its sides rising with slightly more strength than before. The man noticed these changes with quiet focus, each small sign catalogued against the greater risk. It had survived another hour. That meant there was still a chance for the next. The fire softened toward dawn, its light turning from orange to a pale glow. Outside, the first faint calls of morning birds reached the windows. The villager straightened, his back stiff but his eyes still fixed on the cub. It lay motionless now except for its breathing, which had steadied into a fragile rhythm. The whimpers had grown fewer, each one less desperate than the last. The night had not passed easily, but it had passed. In the silence of the room, the weight of what had been fought for lingered. A small body, alive, carried through hours that might have ended it. The villager leaned back slowly, exhaustion pressing against him, but he did not look away. The scarf shifted once more with the cub's faint breath. That was enough. The night had held, and morning was near. The first light of dawn reached the garden, pale and soft across the damp grass. The air was cool, the ground heavy with dew. From the folded blanket by the hearth, the cub had been carried gently outside, still wrapped in the scarf. Its body had survived the long night, though its strength remained thin. The villager set it down among the blades of grass and stepped back, waiting. For a time, the cub did not move. Its body lay low, head pressed close to the earth, breaths shallow but even. The man crouched nearby, silent, patient. Then, slowly, the cub lifted its head. Its eyes opened, clouded but more awake than before. With a faint twitch of its ears, it pressed one paw forward into the wet grass. The leg shook under its own weight, but it held long enough to bring the other paw beside it. Its steps were unsteady, clumsy, yet each one carried the proof that the fight through the night had not been in vain. The villager leaned low, his hands steady in front of him, ready to guide, but not to interfere. The cub staggered again, stumbling slightly as its legs crossed, then righted itself with an awkward push. A soft cry escaped, thin but stronger than the whimpers of the night before. The sound carried through the garden, fragile but insistent. The dew clung to its paws, darkening the fur. Its tail dragged low, unlifted, the weight of weakness still pulling it down. Yet it pressed forward in small bursts, steps uneven but determined. With each stagger, the villager marked the stakes clearly. If strength returned, the cub might live. If exhaustion overcame it, collapse could come quickly and recovery would fade. He whispered once, quietly. The words were carried on his breath. That's it, just a little more. The cub flicked its ears at the sound but did not pause. Its body trembled as it pushed onwards, nosing into the grass where the dew gathered thickest. It sniffed, weak but curious, then let out a soft squeak that broke off into silence. The villager stayed still, watching, giving it space to test itself. Minutes stretched as the cub continued its effort, moving in a small, uneven path across the garden. Its legs faltered often, dropping it briefly into the grass, but each time it rose again. The scarf trailed behind, damp from the ground, its folds brushing across the soil as the cub pulled itself forward. Every movement carried the same truth. It was alive, but only just. The line between survival and loss remained narrow. The man reached once, when the cub stumbled harder than before, catching it gently with one hand to steady it upright. The small body leaned against his palm for a moment, gathering itself, before pressing forward again. The villager let his hand fall back, his eyes fixed on the small figure that wavered, yet continued. The cub's breaths came quicker, its sides lifting in sharp effort, but there was rhythm to them now, not only struggle. When at last the cub stopped, it curled into a crouch near a cluster of wildflowers, paws tucked, head bowed low. It had no strength left to continue, but it had taken steps. That alone was proof of change. The villager knelt nearby, lowering himself into the dew, watching quietly. The family it had been born to was still gone, and the den remained empty. Yet here, in this garden, the fight for life had taken a turn. Survival was not certain, but it was possible. The morning light grew brighter, touching the cub's fur with pale warmth. The villager did not move to lift it yet. He simply watched, the silence filled by the faint sound of birds beginning to call from the hedgerows. The cub rested, sides rising quickly with its breath, ears twitching at each distant note. It had made it to morning, and that was enough. The cub had grown stronger with each passing day. The thin cries that once broke the silence of the cottage had given way to steadier sounds. Soft squeaks carried with more breath than before. Its legs, once trembling under their own weight, now held it for longer moments, though its steps remained unsteady. The villager had fed it carefully, watched it stumble through the small garden, and seen its body fill with a little more life. Yet, even with this fragile progress, one truth remained. This cub belonged to the forest, and without its kin, its survival would always hang in uncertainty. On the 5th morning, he gathered the scarf once more, wrapping the cub inside. Its weight was greater now, still slight but with substance where before there had been almost none. The cub stirred against the cloth, restless, nosing at the folds, its paws pressing faintly as if urging outward. The villager held it firmly but gently, his steps taking him away from the village path, back toward the hedgerows and the line of trees that marked the forest's beginning. The forest edge held a quiet tension. The air was cooler under the shadow of the canopy, the ground damp with moss and fallen leaves. Birds moved in scattered bursts above, their calls sharp against the silence below. The villager stopped just short of the slope where the field opened, holding the cub close to his chest. The stakes were clear. If the mother lived, she might still be searching. If she did not, the cub's fate would rest in hands that could never fully replace her. He crouched, setting the scarf against the base of a tree. The cub shifted, pushing free of the folds, its legs sliding awkwardly before finding purchase on the soil. Its nose twitched, testing the air. A soft whimper escaped, higher and clearer than before, carrying across the slope. The villager waited, his body still, his eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment, there was nothing. The forest remained silent, shadows unmoving. Then, from the far edge of the slope, a shape emerged. Low and cautious, a vixen stepped into view. Her body was lean, her coat ragged in places, but her movements were sharp with awareness. She paused, her head lifting, ears pricked forward. The cub whimpered again, stumbling a few steps toward the sound. The vixen froze, eyes fixed on the small figure. The distance between them was wide, filled with risk. If she sensed the human presence, she might retreat. If she approached, she could reject the cub, leaving it as it had been found, alone. The villager did not move. He kept his breath slow, his body pressed low to the earth, every action meant to erase his presence from the moment that hung between mother and young. The cub pressed forward, weak but insistent, dragging itself across the soil in uneven bursts. Its tail flicked once, its paws catching clumsily on roots, but its cry grew louder, a thin, carrying sound that broke the silence. The vixen's ears twitched sharply. She took one step forward, then another, her body stretched low, cautious but drawn closer. The villager's hands tightened against his knees. The stakes were immediate and unbending. If the vixen turned away, the cub's fight for life would return to human care, fragile and uncertain. If she accepted, its survival would return to the wild where it belonged. The distance closed slowly. The cub paused, panting faintly, then let out another squeak, raw but insistent. The vixen's body shifted, her head lowering, nose pushing forward into the wind. She was listening, measuring, deciding. The air held stillness as heavy as stone. The man did not speak, did not shift. His role was finished the moment the vixen appeared. All that remained was silence, patience, and hope. The cub called once more, softer now, its strength nearly spent. The vixen froze, ears angled sharply forward, the moment held between them, fragile as breath. The forest waited. The cub stood at the edge of the slope, its legs still unsteady, its paws sinking slightly into the soft soil. The villager had set it down with careful hands, then stepped back, leaving only distance between them. The scarf, damp from the journey, fell open on the ground, and the cub nosed free of it, sniffing at the air. Its ears flicked, catching sounds in the undergrowth. For a long moment it stood still, swaying gently. Then it moved forward in short, uncertain steps. Across the slope, the vixen broke her stillness. She had lingered at the edge of the trees, cautious, her body low, eyes fixed on the cub. Now, with a sharp lift of her head, she stepped forward. Her movements were quick but not reckless. Ears pricked, tail stiff, body braced in both suspicion and hope. The cub turned at the sound of her paws against the earth, its head jerking, nose lifting sharply into the air. A faint cry rose from its throat, thin but clear, carrying across the space between them. The vixen rushed closer, covering the distance in a low, smooth run. She slowed as she neared, her muzzle pushing forward until it pressed against the cub's side. The cub stumbled under her nudge, then leaned into her, its body curling instinctively toward the warmth it had been denied. The vixen nosed it firmly again, a gesture both sharp and tender, pressing the young one into her chest. The cub answered with another squeak, softer now, and its small body pressed close against hers. The villager stood still, watching. His hands fell to his sides, the scarf left on the ground behind him. He did not move forward and did not call out. His part in this had ended the moment the vixen stepped in. The wild had returned to the wild, and the line between them was not his to cross. What was at stake had been clear from the first cry in the grass. If the cub remained in human care, survival might linger, but never fully. In the vixen's care, its life could return to its place, fragile still, but whole. The vixen turned once, her eyes catching his outline briefly, though there was no recognition beyond wariness. She pressed her body around the cub and began to lead it toward the forest. The cub stumbled, its legs faltering in the dew-wet grass, but each time it wavered, the vixen nudged it on, steady and insistent. Together they moved slowly toward the tree line, the small figure pressing against the larger, guided step by step back into the cover of the wild. The villager remained where he was, silent, his breath slow, his gaze following them until the shadows of the trees took them in. The cub looked back once, a clumsy turn of its head, before the vixen urged it forward again. Then they were gone, the sound of their steps fading into the hush of leaves. The slope emptied. The field grew still. A faint wind moved across the grass, bending it in waves, and the morning light spread soft and pale through the clearing. The scarf lay on the earth, damp and quiet, the only trace of what had passed. The villager stepped back, his part finished. The miracle was not in what he had done, but in the moment when the cub found its way home.